my early life begins in Cooksville, Ontario, which was ultimately swallowed up by Mississauga. And I was very much a member of the small Croatian community that lived there. In fact, I thought everyone was Croatian because as a child, you don't have a sense of how big is the situation. But my father had come to Canada quite early, 1925. By 1930s, he was getting concerned about his lack of a family and contacted his family, who contacted my mother's family. And lo and behold, my mother, like many other women, hustled out of Croatia. She accepted the offer after they had exchanged letters and etc. And she came out in 1939 and they were married, and I was born in 41. They did have a little time period to wait to make a decision about whether or not to go ahead. My mother says she recalls this handsome looking boy who had walked past her house once. So in a sense, you wonder how these things worked out, but for me as a child, it worked out beautifully. And so Cooksville was a really great experience. We had a boarding house because that's how many Croatian women could work. Their husbands didn't necessarily like them to go out to work. And I'm reciting this in part because I actually went back in the 90s and interviewed some of the women who were still alive at the time to get their sense of what it was like for them in the 30s and 40s when they had come as early people to Cooksville. And many of them ran boarding houses, and that was, as one woman put it, sheer hell, because they had to work so hard. But I, as a child, was favored by these 5 or 6 men who lived in the house and who treated me to ice cream and orange crush and anything I wanted because there were no other children around. So I had a really quite an idyllic experience. My mother ended up working in a munitions factory during the war. The next door neighbor was a very kind, gentle man, a Croatian, who looked after me during the day. And my dad had, by then, he had a job in the brickyard. In the initial years in Canada, you couldn't find work. It was the Depression era. And so he traveled yearly to Edmonton, but really couldn't find work along the way. But for me as a child, it was a great growing up experience. However, my mother promoted the idea of using their knowledge and skills as peasants, which is an honorable state in Croatia, as farmers basically, to get a farm in Burlington, Ontario. And that's where I did a lot of my growing up.
Wow.
And the things that influenced me, I think, in that instance, later on, my mother visited a lot of people in hospitals. I remember thinking about this at one point, and I thought the way she approached people in hospitals had an impact on me. She could just sit with people and listen to them, ask questions. And I think I took this in, and I think it did influence me. And later I thought, aha, she modeled how you pay attention to people and how you take in their information and give them comfort just by being there.
Wow. And I'm wondering, Burlington is now an urban center. So just approximately where in Burlington was the farm?
It was on Fairview Avenue, and I've come full circle because last year our high school celebrated I think its 100th year, Burlington Central High School. I hope I'm correct on that. And they had the gala party for us, the older folks, in I think the Polish Canadian Center, which was on the very spot where our house had been. Wow. On Fairview Avenue, close to Drury Lane. And I thought, I've come full circle.
Wow.
And so that was really interesting because I could tell people there was a creek over there were tadpoles that I collected, and that's where I walked to school. My first language was Croatian, spoken in a way that wasn't really a scholarly language because my parents had grade 5 education. They valued education, but they didn't have the scholarly language, and they were trying to survive in Canada, which meant they learned to speak a mixture. I mean, they spoke a mixture of English and Croatian, and that's what I learned. And on my first trip to Croatia to meet this large extended family on both sides, I realized I don't really know how to speak Croatian. But it was a good experience, and we lived there for quite a few years until my mother had a stroke in her early 40s, and there was no therapy available. We didn't have a car, so we moved into central part of Burlington, and that's where I spent a lot of the growing up years, going to Burlington High School ultimately, and then to McMaster.
Oh. So tell us about your studies at McMaster.
Well, my studies at McMaster were delightful. I thank my principal in high school, James Bates, whom I didn't ever thank in person, for prompting me to go to the orientation I was going to go to normal school and be a teacher. I somehow had an idea that teaching was an area for me. But he said, have you gone to the orientation? No, I haven't. I think you should. And then the next year in grade 13, he said, have you put in your application for McMaster? No, I haven't. I was still a relatively compliant person. I became less compliant as the years went on. But what a blessing that was that he directed me to go. And the first person who interviewed me at McMaster was Dr. Frank Valley, who was in sociology and anthropology. He was a social anthropologist. And he picked up on the fact that I like to work with people. I had worked in parks and recreation a lot of those growing up years. So I was a day camp leader and then ultimately a day camp director in Burlington. He picked up on my interest in working with people and thought sociology might be a good fit. And he was right. He was very right. And so those early people in sociology were very influential. Frank Jones, who I think was one of the original professors in that program, Frank Valley, Michael Ames, Rodney Crook, Peter Pinio, they really were terrific, and that 4-year honors course was ideal for me. But sociology, well, it influenced me a great deal. I remember that I did a paper on what we called at the time Indians, like I living in Canada. I had grown up in Burlington. I knew about Joseph Brant, Teandaega, so I was familiar with some First Nations history, but not much. And I am so sorry that I don't have that paper anymore, because I twice drove up to Brantford to go to the Six Nations Reserve to complete that paper to see. I wonder what I was thinking at the time, but it was those profs were very influential. And they were very upset with me when I went to a recruitment interview that Dr. Betty Govan conducted, and she was at the University of Toronto. But by 3rd year, I had a sense that I wasn't as oriented to being that positivistic, and qualitative work wasn't yet really prominent in the sociology that they were presenting. Everything was try to be experimental, develop your hypothesis, do your testing. And I thought, I still like direct work with people, and that interview with her was very influential. As my late partner Jim Bripton said, she was one of the first feminists at the University of Toronto in the School of Social Work there. And I thought, maybe social work is the profession, because it gives me that chance to be in direct contact with people. That was not to my professor's liking. Social work was a rather lower status profession in the 50s, early 60s, and they were rather disappointed with me. But we survived that, and later reconnected actually at Carleton.
Okay. So what year did you graduate from McMaster?
McMaster, I graduated in 1963. Okay. And by then I had made the decision to go into social work. And having had the most wonderful trip in grade 11 to New York City, it was superb. Our high school went with Westdale from Hamilton. And I was so taken with New York City because of the excitement of that urban setting in the late 50s, that must have been the late 50s, because it was in high school. I was convinced that I would be living in New York City. So quite frankly, I chose Columbia University and was accepted, which was delightful, because I had by then learned that Columbia was one of the top schools in social work in North America. However, they were not prepared to offer me a scholarship. My grades were good. I needed to be supervised by a MSW social worker over that interim period before the term started in September, and if my evaluation was good, then they would consider me for a scholarship. Do you think I could find an MSW social worker and a job? I found an old-time University of Toronto BSW, Miss Jackie Moffat, and she hired me as a case aide in Hamilton General. And that was a terrific learning opportunity. It really helped me to realize that I really did like this thing called social work, because I really wasn't that familiar with what do we actually do. But social workers had a lot of autonomy in that particular hospital. However, I was a little annoyed, let's say, or disappointed that I would have to wait until after the end of that job to see if Columbia would actually offer me the scholarship. And let's face it, in those days, bursaries and scholarships and your summer employment were what carried you. By then I had decided, and this was a good lesson, always have an alternative plan. So I had applied to the University of Ottawa, St. Patrick's School of Social Welfare, because I knew I was very self-focused on getting to New York City. I knew they had placements in New York City.
Very wise.
Very wise. They accepted me and I got a scholarship. Perfect. So I went there. I did have 2 wonderful placements in New York State.
Oh.
Rochester, New York, and Potsdam, New York. And so I could visit my friends who had an apartment, a cockroach-filled apartment off Times Square. But at least I did get to New York City, and I'm so sorry. Imagine being in New York City in the 60s.
Wow.
That would have been absolutely wonderful, but I'm not complaining. I had 2 great field placements in Rochester and in a home hospital for the elderly, as well as at family service. That was year 1, and those were 6-month field placements, so we got quite intensively involved. And then the one in Potsdam, New York, was on the university campus, Potsdam State University. So I really had terrific experiences in my 2 placements. And we also had, I think, very impressive professors, ranging from he was Father Swithenbowers when I was a student, and then he became Dr. Swithenbowers. He was the founder and the director of the program. Alice Sellian, who had been in child welfare. Frank Turner, who was really fundamental in terms of focusing on theory and research and social work. And Orm Stanton, as I recall. And there was a psychiatrist too, and I'm blocking on his name, but he wasn't a social worker. But it was a great learning experience and a wonderful cohort of people because they really emphasized connecting with other students, and some of them have remained my lifelong friends.
How wonderful.
Yes.
So what were some of the issues or areas of focus when you were studying in the 60s?
And because we were in the United States, we did, and also when I was at McMaster, the Vietnam War was on. And so even though that was distant for us in a sense, we were aware that there's trouble here, big time trouble. And when we were in the States, we did get to know some US social work students who lived not that far away. And of course, we were in the environment there in the United States, so we were aware of some of the civil rights occurrences. Plus, I remember being at the placement on, I think, November 22nd, 1963, when John Kennedy was shot. So that was a really earth-shattering kind of moment for us. We certainly became aware of civil rights and racism. I can't say that I was as politically attuned to things as I later became, but we were still aware of issues of racism, of issues of people in wars where they didn't want to be, and people protesting. Civil rights became really important, and I must say, when we were back in our program, we brought these issues with us, and they were happening in Canada too, but it was a little more lower key, and we were not quite as, what shall I say, enraged perhaps by some of the issues. Although later on in the 70s, I think there was much more active engagement with some of these issues. I remember the students at Carleton in the late 60s, early 70s were much more tuned in to civil rights, for example.
So what year did you graduate?
I graduated from McMaster in 63 and then 65 from St. Patrick's School of Social Welfare. And it was overall, it met my needs, and as I say, the professors were very dedicated. Values were really emphasized, and of course Swithenbowers, with his religious background, he had been an oblate priest, and he didn't quite finish his doctorate when the bishop asked him to go and start up that school. And he had to leave behind his doctorate, but he was very oriented to ethical issues and the values of social work. I can remember Felix Beistek's book on values, and so I think we took that in, and the values were ones that we felt guided not only our professional life, but our personal life too. Certainly fairness and equality and respect for people. So that was very much in my head when we finished. It was a very successful learning experience, all in all.
Super. So then what happened? Where did you go after graduation?
Well, I was thinking about that, and I thought, I wonder what you will think of the fact that after I graduated, thanks to the scholarships and my summer employment, because I worked at Hamilton Family Service, that's one summer in between, and that was also a good learning experience because Hamilton was a city that had a lot of issues. There was a lot of poverty in Hamilton at that time, and working at family service meant that I went to see a lot of older people who were living in all kinds of horrid situations, and I became very tuned in to some of the struggles of these older people. Just as in the year before, when I was a case aide in the hospital, so many people came to the medical clinics that were free. There would be so many people that they couldn't be seen by the physicians. And you really were aware of how much poverty existed and what it did to people when they had to scramble to get health coverage, and also living conditions were really very poor for some of these older folks who were without much income. So Hamilton really, and Hamilton in the East End in particular, was where the steel company was. Living conditions were not great. I had godparents who lived in that East End, and I can remember you used to wipe the dust off buildings and cars and so on. It was just that bad in terms of health. Yes. So I learned a lot in Hamilton, and that was good. But then in '65, when I finished my master's, I still had, I think I had $500 left from all the scholarship and everything. And I was aware of having a large extended family on both sides in Croatia, and wanted to go to Europe because it was like, now I was ready for the world. I had my master's, and before I would take a position, I wanted to go to Europe. Well, my friend, now Dr. Mary Kay O'Neill, said she too wanted to go to Europe. And while I was fairly independent, I said, okay, we can go together, although I really wanted to go by myself. Do you know, we spent 5 months there. So what I did, in a sense, after getting the MSW, was open myself up to the world. It was a real learning experience in terms of art. Mary Kay had studied art history in her university undergrad, and so it opened up many different areas of life, and it was just a wonderful experience, especially connecting with family. My parents had kept their connection, but in those days when immigrants left, they knew they might not ever return. But they kept the connection, and I was greeted like a long-lost daughter, and so I realized I had a real grounding. I did have a large family, and they loved me as if I had been lost to them and now I was found. And I thank my parents for having maintained that connection, because it really helped me, in a sense, form who I was. And so as Mary Kay and I came back, I still had $50 near the end of the trip.
Amazing.
I know, we had 27 stopovers on our flight because it was by mileage. So you could fly from city to city and stay in hostels for 25 to 50 cents. So that's why we still had money left over. And I went to Boston to visit my supervisor in Potsdam. She and her husband had by then moved to Boston. And I went to Montreal because I still had the mileage. So I really realized how much I loved travel and how those experiences opened me up to the world and the issues in the wider world. Now, that was a limited wider world. That was Europe, but it was what we could do at that time. And when we came back, we both found that social workers were in really high demand. We were getting interviews left, right, and center. We had both decided on Toronto. Mary Kay because of her psychiatric interest, which was also mine too. I thought that would be a very challenging area of social work practice, and it intrigued me. And after going to numerous interviews, she chose the Clark, I chose Lakeshore Psychiatric. And they were really, I loved the setting because it was on Lake Ontario, I have to admit. Visual experiences are important to me, physical experiences like landscaping and so on. They are important to me. I think they were important to the patients too. It was a great setting at the time, now less so, but at the time it was if you were going to be ill and hospitalized for some psychiatric condition, Lakeshore Psychiatric, I think, stood out quite positively, and there was good supervision. Elaine Kay was my supervisor, and she had graduated from the University of Toronto, and they had quite a well-developed social work program. So I was going into a good place with lots of supervision, and the other great thing was that with the physician who was the psychiatrist, Dr. Ian Bond, he respected everybody's input. You were really not made to feel you are the handmaiden of the physician kind of thing. And there were some physicians who really lorded it over all the other staff. But Dr. Bond was different. He was really very respectful of everybody's input. So I had the good fortune to work with him in that first women's unit. And then a novel experience evolved. Dr. Richard Steffi, who was a psychologist, wanted to develop the first adolescent unit in a psychiatric hospital in Canada. There just hadn't been an adolescent unit. And I was asked to be the social worker after about a year and a half working with women in the women's unit. Was I interested in moving to this other unit where I would be the social worker who worked with patients, that was important, and their families and the community setting. And I said yes, because again, I thought this is a rare opportunity. It's behavior modification is just coming in, learning theory is becoming a much more prominent approach. And while I certainly didn't consider myself to be an expert in it, I thought this could work, and it did. I again worked with really interesting people who were really ahead of their time, I think. And Dr. Bond was still the psychiatrist for that unit, and he was ready to risk. For example, and that was inspiring. We had adolescent girls who were sexually active. What do? Birth control is illegal. He prescribed birth control if it seemed to be a safe way to go. And that was quite a risk in this is prior to 1969 when birth control became legal. He went ahead and did it. And that again is inspiring when you see people ready to risk their professional careers for the well-being of the people they're working with. And I would have been happy to stay in practice. I had a thought about getting a PhD, but at that time, you really needed in most programs at least 2 years of practical experience as a social worker. That was the requirement in a couple of places when I explored it, because it was dawning on me that maybe I should get a doctorate. It wasn't a firm idea, but I was thinking about it. But then I thought, well, most programs require that practice experience, so I might as well go ahead and get some practice experience, because that's what social work is all about, working directly with people. And again, it was a good staff. And the hospital had changed in that era. You know, there still were in the back the old water baths that people used to be immersed in. You could still find the occasional straitjacket somewhere. I did know one patient who had a lobotomy and saw her before and after, and that was a scary experience. Electroshock, which now has come back again in favor, was quite prominent. It was, but we were evolving out of that era, and there was more medication available for various aspects. However, I think the big dilemma was that deinstitutionalization had started to occur, and we were supposed to somehow get people into the community. And I remember the social worker who had the community sort of as her primary area, she said, it's a great idea, but we don't have the group home settings. We simply don't have them, and that's in the early 60s. And so that was the time when a lot of folks were sent out into the community, but there really weren't the resources there to pick them up. And that was really difficult, because we knew that you had to have places, but there was also the isolation, which I think still characterizes some hospital settings. Here's the hospital, here's the community, and you couldn't make the connection very easily between the various settings. Mm-hmm. So that's where I stayed till 1968, when Dr. Bowers phoned one day and said, we're interested in you joining the faculty. Are you interested? I think I was 27 at that time. And I was just dumbfounded. And I said, yes. And he said, don't you want to think about it? I thought, oh dear, I've been premature in just saying yes, but I recognized that it was a golden opportunity. And I said, yes, I'll give you a call back. I'll think about it. I thought about it for a few days and called him and said yes, and joined the faculty in 1968. It was still in buildings that related to Algonquin College, but on the St. Patrick's campus. We had not yet moved to the main campus. There was a transfer of the program in 1972, I think. But that's when I started my university teaching career. And you know, think nowadays, people don't get invited usually, but I was, and I was thrilled. Just as I'm thrilled to be here, having you invite me to do this interview.
So what was the transition from practice to academia like?
I was supposed to bring in new ideas. I remember that was one of the things Dr. Bowers had said. We want you to bring in, he was a great orator, bring in some of those new ideas. And I thought, new ideas, what are these new ideas? But what I'm pretty sure he was talking about was feminism was emerging as a ideology that was becoming increasingly prominent. Ideas about equality, about fairness, about women and men being treated in similar ways in the workplace. There was a lot of the sexual revolution was on. So it was again a time where there was a lot of social change. And I guess he saw me as a younger person who might be able to connect with the students who were also more or less in the same age range as I was. And I think there was a greater appreciation of the social context as a source for some of these issues, which is why I think I was handed the course that the psychiatrist had been teaching, because it was very much focused on individual pathology. And I certainly didn't ignore individual pathology, but the feminism that was becoming a part of who I was, and I was really drawn to feminist ideas of Germaine Greer, or the names are almost starting to escape me, but I mean people who were very prominent and who were saying we must pay attention to the social context in which women are living and how that figures in their particular problems that they're presenting. Plus, there was a beginning interest, certainly, in how is sexuality expressed in our society. And so those, even back in Hamilton, the one person who was working with people with sexual problems was Carl Cunanan. And I remember learning about that because nobody was working with people with sexual problems, but Carl was. And he was at family service at that time. And I remember thinking, wow, that's really radical, because it was unheard of. And especially that social workers were engaged in this rather taboo topic. Mm-hmm. And so those were influences that were prominent, but I was tasked with bringing in some of these new ideas. And I tried to do that. And I think I was successful. I still have one of the few lectures that I actually recorded, like I didn't record it with audio or anything, but I actually printed it all up in 1971, as I recall. And at the end, and I did try to bring in these ideas, especially about feminism and equality in relationships and fairness and how things were changing. Gender wasn't yet quite a concept, even though we talked about issues that we now would say gender. We called them sex roles, for example, at the time. But at the end of that lecture, the students applauded, and I was dumbfounded. And I think it was because I was saying things that connected with their own lives at that point. Many of them were in their 20s, in their early 30s, and they were experiencing some of the same social changes that were going on. Pierre Trudeau had, had an omnibus bill, I think it was in 1967, that it touched on a lot of issues related to sexuality. And that had an impact on people. That was when he made that famous statement about the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation.
Yes.
And that really registered with people, because it meant, hey, there's something going on here about sexual expression, and especially for women, because women's sexuality, even though Masters and Johnson were doing their work, still a lot was geared toward male perceptions of sexuality, and women's role in this was not given that kind of prominence. So it was a great time, actually, to be involved in change. And school was very clinically oriented, I will say that. We were not exactly being prepared to be activists or to take on major challenges. But again, Swithin Bowers was very much, I think, ahead of his time, and in the sense of recognizing. He also hired my person who became my late partner, Dr. James Gripton, for the same kind of reason, that Jim could bring in much more of a social policy focus and community orientation, and give that much more prominence in the program. And it's not surprising to me that Jim and I were somewhat drawn together, because we again shared some similar ideas about what could evolve. And without going into all the things, I don't know all the things you want to know, but that's what led us to think about offering a course in human sexuality, which was one, if not the first. The other course was at University of Toronto with Dr. Ben Schlesinger, but that was with medicine, and so it was oriented not just for social workers. And Bert Mark Hughes at the University of Calgary had a course, but again, that was a service course for the university. Ours was one of the, if not the earliest course that was directed for social work students, but it took us 2 years of lobbying because there was a lot of opposition. And I think that course really taught, getting that course approved, let's say, was really something that helped me realize how important it was for social workers to be out front and to do things that maybe didn't meet all the traditional norms that were in place. And do you know who helped a lot? People in sociology.
Wow.
Bruce McFarlane, I remember he was very helpful, but some of my other former profs were also now at Carleton. They had, Peter Pignot had gone there, Frank Valley had gone there. They were also helpful. But it took us 2 years, and there was a lot of opposition, and I regret to say some of the opposition came not from our field instructors or students. We had done surveys with them. They wanted courses with sexuality in them. Some of our faculty did not. They thought it belonged to medicine. Well, medicine was just at the beginning in terms of teaching about sexuality, and we didn't have a medical school at at Carleton anyway. So who was going to be doing this? But the field instructors and the students, they wanted material about sexuality. So that was an impetus for us. And it helped me realize what you have to do sometimes to achieve certain goals. That was useful. I didn't plan it, but it happened, and I learned from it.
Wow. So what were some of the things that you had to do in order to make that happen? Like, what were some of the practical?
We had to lobby.
Okay.
We really had to talk to lots of people in the university to try to demonstrate to them that this is an important topic. No one's really picking up on sexual issues in various relationships. Sure, we're teaching about relationships, but this area of sexuality was somehow shunted off to the side, that there was a research base for it, that we weren't just presenting opinions. There was material that we could draw on that had a research component to it. That obviously is very important in the university. And that we were not immoral or perverted ourselves, because there was a lot of personal attacks that somehow we were not in a personal relationship, I should note that, other than friends and colleagues, but that we were not somehow off the wall with respect to sexuality. So lobbying was really critical. And that was probably the main thing that we had to do, was lobby, talk to a lot of people, so that when our course was presented as an elective in the spring program of 72, 73, that's the best we could do, an elective. Well, the students just, we easily got our 10 students. That's all we wanted to teach to in that first year, because we wanted to teach it as experientially as we could, i.e. with small groups and opportunities to get to know your community, etc. And then co-teach it. That was also somewhat unusual to be co-teaching in that time. Mm-hmm. But we thought, like the Masters and Johnson model, we thought it would be useful to have a male and female as people who taught the course, so that students could hear different perspectives. And in the end, we did say we're choosing 5 men and 5 women for the course, and we'd like to videotape it.
Wow.
And they all agreed to that, because we thought, this is a first, so I still have the videotapes of that first course.
Wow, that must be fascinating.
Well, I think it is fascinating. And one of the things we later, when Jim and I were partners, and we were both at the University of Denver, where I did in 73 go for my doctorate, and we were asked to teach the first course at the University of Denver. And they pointed out to us that we had actually beat the DSM. DSM in 73 had taken homosexuality out of their pathology listing of pathologies, and we had done that in our course. We were not teaching about orientation as a pathology. It was just one of the orientations that people might have. So that was fairly radical again in that time period. But it convinced us that this was a topic that was of real importance for social work. And I must say, people like Dr. Harvey Gilcross were in Hawaii. He was one of the pioneers. and the person who really came up with ideas about the sexual oppression of people. And that idea of oppression and social workers dealing with oppression, we were there then focusing on who was sexually oppressed. Adolescents, older people, people with disabilities, but then anti-oppressiveness sort of became a much more prominent feature of social work in general. But for us, we started with the sexuality and who, I remember Harvey would talk about who were the favored sexual people, the Yavis people, Y-A-V-I-S, young, affluent, verbal, and intellectual, successful. Those were the people who got, sort of could meet their sexual needs. People who weren't Yavis people tended not to. They had more difficulties getting their sexuality acknowledged. So we felt very much in the throes, I guess, of the sexual revolution and felt this was important. That there were rights that people had to sexual expression that was safe. Of course, by then, birth control was okay, so that was helpful. And then homosexuality became increasingly, less, it wasn't criminalized, and it became more prominent. But then reproductive rights was also a major aspect. I mean, Morgentaler was there, with his abortion clinics, getting acquitted and going forward. I mean, he was inspirational. So that also created, as we know in Canada, great furor to have this man who was ready to risk everything, his professional being, abortion was possible, I think, in the late 60s, but it wasn't as liberal as it ultimately became, and thanks to somebody like Morgentaler and his supporters. So that was very influential for us too. There was a lot going on, I think, in Canada in terms of greater liberation for everyone.
Yeah. I mean, maybe this question is embedded in the stories you've already told, but what drew you to want to focus on sexuality?
No, I think I can answer that because
Okay.
you do a lot of, especially with the students, you do a lot of introspection yourself. I know sometimes, there's a question you might ask me later about what training did you get? Well, there wasn't any place we could really go. We went to hear Catherine Chilman in Detroit giving a workshop on something like child welfare and sexuality. That was the best we could do in the early 1970s. There really was, we knew about Masters and Johnson. We taught some of their work as it was becoming available, but there were feminists who were talking about sexuality, but there really wasn't anywhere where you could prepare yourself. Many Croatians are Catholic. The country is, even now the country is like this. The government and Catholicism are very close. My parents were not, they did go to, once we were moved into the central part of Burlington, they did go to the Catholic Church. I went to a Catholic school for grades 5 to 8. But I wouldn't describe myself as an ardent Catholic because I came to it late as a child, in a sense, by grade 5 or so. And I did find there were things that just didn't really make sense to me. And one of them was certainly teachings about sexuality. I chose to go to a public school rather than go to Hamilton to Cathedral. I also knew I could play more sports if I could go to the public school. But I think that prompted the interest in sexuality because I grew up in that Catholic, with the Catholic teaching that we used to laugh about, what impure thoughts have you had?
All immodest actions,
Yeah.
looks or deeds,
That's
all
right.
immodest thoughts,
That's right.
music or plays.
That's right. It just wasn't acceptable to have a sexual sense of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember in university, when the birth control started to become available. It might not have been legal till 69, but it was becoming available and there always were people who were trying to help people with contraception. But I remember a statement, and I was an undergrad, where the Catholic Church said, no, birth control is not acceptable. And I remember that really hit me. I thought all these years we have been preached to about don't get pregnant. Whatever you must not get pregnant, which means deny who you are, don't get involved in anything sexual because it might lead to an unwanted pregnancy. And I thought, birth control, wow, there's maybe a way out of this. and then the church said, no, this is not acceptable. I think that was very influential for me, because I thought, that this just doesn't make sense. And I tried to understand it by talking to priests and so on, but it started to make less and less sense to me. But I think some of those experiences really did prompt me. Plus Croatians, the teaching there was fairly Catholic. I wasn't supposed to date. That had to be a kind of, after all, my mother said, we somehow managed in groups, you went out with a group. I said, well, here they go out with, another individual. So there were those repressive aspects. And I think you find this with sex educators. We used to joke about it, that many of us came from those kind of backgrounds, loved, but things around sexuality were not given full attention, shall we say. And it did influence us in terms of teaching. We wanted to make sure that we could do something to open it up. And I would say we did for years an exercise in class where we would ask students, years, I'd say over 30 years, we asked the same question. Think about an experience you had with your parents in terms of having a talk about sex, etc. What were you feeling? What were your parents likely feeling? It was very rare that you heard from a student, well, I felt relieved that I could ask and my parents seemed comfortable. That was not the common response. It was discomfort on both sides, the child and the parents. Discomfort. That was the prominent response well over our next 30 or nearly 40 years of teaching human sexuality. So I thought we weren't alone. I wasn't alone. It was a very common occurrence, but it all was helpful in terms of prompting us. Plus, there was the discrimination, especially about homosexuality, a lot of discrimination. It was not a pleasant time if you happened to have an interest that wasn't part of the sort of mainstream. And I think I became aware of sort of justice issues through people like Harvey Gocross, who was talking about sexual oppression, who was sexually oppressed, who could not adopt a baby, for example, or a child. And there were a lot of people who were not seen as being able to adopt. And those, again, were the people whose sexuality was somehow not acknowledged. That was part of it. But also, I think if I look back in my own family, I think my parents were quite smart and quite with it. But my dad didn't really have many rights in his work situations. He worked as a laborer all his life. And if he ever, I can remember hearing that if you spoke up, you had to be careful. You might get laid off. You might be the next one to get laid off. And I think that had an impact on me in terms of the sort of social justice. What kind of a world do we live in if you try to assert, they had half an hour for lunch. I remember he wanted a little more time so he could ride his bike to the bank. Oh no, you can't have that. Oh, come on. So there were issues I remember for him in the workplace. And I think that influenced me around thinking about justice and what's justice all about.
Very interesting. And do you remember some of the content from the early course?
Oh, yes. Vocabulary of sex. That was one of our early ones. We wanted to help our students not only hear words that they didn't usually hear. I don't know if we could teach in the same way now because there's been so much about what triggers people, etc. But vocabulary of sex, the fact that there were legal vocabularies, there were religious vocabularies, there were vocabularies, slang vocabularies, and so we did a lot of exercises. We devised lots of exercises that we wrote about, and I think some of them became common exercises in teaching human sexuality. Certainly that was one. We tried to focus on, we did have a session on orientation, and it wasn't on homosexuality, it was on orientation and what's that all about, so that we would recognize that we weren't probably, the fluidity wasn't yet a word, but certainly we were aware of bisexuality and transgender, not that much, but the Canadian Sex Research Forum was an organization we knew about. We knew at least one transgendered person, so we had a session on orientation. We also had sessions that related to the people that we thought were particularly oppressed, like older people. Older people's sexuality was just didn't exist. But there were films. There was a lovely couple in the Netherlands and we did use sexually explicit materials. from the Unitarian Church, I think in San Francisco. Sometimes we had to have the films sent from San Francisco to Detroit, and then University of Windsor would drive their truck across, pick up the films and bring them into Canada, because you couldn't bring in some of these films that had sexually explicit content. Masturbation, for example, that was one early session. That was a real taboo topic. Self-pleasuring, what do you mean by self-pleasuring, and so on. So we did use those kinds of films. There was one called Board and Care. These are very still with me, but then we taught for a long time. Board and Care was about persons who intellectually had some disability, and yet they still could be aroused and fall in love and want to connect with people, wanted touch. Well, all of these things in most institutions, if they happen to be in institutions, were forbidden. So we had that, and aging, people with disabilities, as I recall, those are probably the two key social problem areas that we were dealing with. But of course, just sexuality throughout the lifespan, that was very important, the developmental issues. So I'm a little out of order in terms of how the course evolved. But those were some pretty basic, and of course, even though we called it rape at the time, it wasn't sexual assault yet, it was rape. So sexual abuse, and even sexual abuse wasn't really a term that we used, but we were aware of transgressions and forcible sexual encounters, and that too was a topic of great concern to lots of folks in that era. So that's some of the content from that course.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about how this was received by the social work community, particularly beyond the academic community, right? So lots of professional identity organizations and processes were happening at the same time. How did people take it up?
I would say again, students, and we saw a lot of students over the years, certainly and practitioners, well received. We really had no particular backlash. I went for my doctoral program in '73 to University of Denver. As I say, they asked us fairly early on, since we were both there. Jim was offered a position there, which was wonderful. He came to visit me and was offered a position and took it the next year. And we were asked to teach a course, which we did. So we were well received, again, by that university. They recognized that this was somewhat groundbreaking and they wanted to be in on the ground floor. Where we experienced backlash was in 1976, after I had returned to Ottawa for a year because the health and welfare scholarship, not required, but the more you worked in Canada as a social worker, the less you'd have to pay back, and I didn't really want to pay back anything. So in '76, Jim got an offer to go to the University of Calgary to begin their doctoral program, because he's one of the few people who had the background to start up a PhD program. And I had moved with him. I was very traditional in that regard. I followed, in a sense, followed my partner's career, but I was perfectly confident doing it. And in due course and after a year, got a permanent position there. That's where we experienced, not from the university, but from people in the community. They heard about teaching. There was a film we used, Am I Normal, as I recall, was the title of it. And there was a great furor about that. Sex education was not really that acceptable in the schools. The Rape Crisis Center, which I helped found, I was one of the founding members in '76, they could get into the schools, but they weren't given the freedom to teach about sexuality in a more positive way. And so anything about sex education in the schools was not looked on favorably by some components of the population in Alberta. So that's where we got the backlash, to the point where I remember there were a few letters apparently to the president of the university about how we should be fired for our immoral perspective on teaching. But the community as a whole, we were asked to do lots of workshops locally and beyond Calgary, so we did. We were in Regina, back in the East Coast in Newfoundland and so on. So there was a really quite positive response from social work I would say as a community.
I'm so grateful. Glad
Yeah.
to hear that.
And then we got more into, as time progressed, let's say 70s, 80s, more into boundary issues, because by then we were becoming aware of the transgressions that were occurring in practice, as well as in the wider community, but things that were happening between practitioners and their clients, and not just sexual, but just boundary issues. So we spent a lot of time on working on different boundary issues and sort of the gray areas within practice. And again, I think that was helpful to social workers. We developed a model, I remember, of how you try to make decisions in these gray areas where boundary isn't so, it might be clear cut about sexual abuse. You do not have sex with your clients, etc. But there are a whole lot of boundary issues where it's not quite so clear cut. You're in a rural community, you're the only source of help, and so on. So we spent quite a bit of our professional time doing some of those workshops too, on all kinds of boundary issues. So I would say profession, by and large, was very receptive, and our course continued as long as we were there. We were teaching it from, we had an internship with Dr. Kathy Cairns and Dr. Brian Woodward at Foothills. There was a gender dysphoria clinic. That was one of the DSM, what shall I say, diagnosis that remained, gender dysphoria, where people had difficulties about their identity. So that was the only place where we could learn more about sexuality. So we were supervised by them for a year on an internship, and then we became very connected with the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, ASECT, and got our certifications as sex educators first, then counselors, and then therapists, then realized we didn't need the counselors because the therapists could do everything that counselors did. But we were among the early people in Canada to get those certifications, which also I think helped establish sexuality issues as an important part of practice and the wider community. And by then there was a lot of attention being paid to the ways in which homosexuals, in particular gays, where gay became a more common term, how they were discriminated against. That Vrend case was prominent in Alberta, where the fellow who was homosexual got fired from his teaching position. So we got quite involved as allies in terms of what was going on, why were we so discriminatory, etc. We always had representation on campus from GLASS, Gay Lesbians Association, Student Union, something like that. So and of course we got involved with Calgary Birth Control Association they started in the late 60s, we came in 76. So again, reproductive issues were very prominent and we got involved in that. But the biggest furor that I think, and I credit Jim for this as much, well, he was much more central, was we wrote the changing definition of the family. We thought it was important to say families exist in many different shapes and forms, and it was a long, long letter to the editor. It was more like an opinion piece. Well, that created a great furor because the school board was very upset with us because really they wanted the biological man, woman, and child kind of as that's the family. And all these things you're saying about the many different forms of family arrangements, that's not okay. That was a big issue in the, I'm going to say the 80s, because we were saying that's the reality and here are the facts. And if we're not preparing our students for that reality in schools, and certainly at the university, we're remiss. But we did get negative, not from social work itself, but the wider community, or components of the wider community. And I think that this still continues in Alberta. There's still factions in the rural community, but also in our current UCP government that are still very anti some of these kinds of things. So sexuality as a prominent feature in the curriculum has sort of evolved. It's not that prominent anymore. It's been worked into other courses. I'm not close enough to it to know how that actually works for students and practitioners. And I also think we probably would have difficulty teaching it the way we taught it, because we were very open and very explicit about sexuality, and I'm I think we probably have to be much more cautious. We always warn students, here's the course outline, see what's happening, here's what we're teaching, decide if this is what you want. Nobody was compelled to come to class, but we wanted them to be prepared. We never had difficulties with students. But I think now there are waves of conservatism, if I don't want to blame all conservatives, I'm not, but there are people who are still not comfortable with this topic, especially now. So that's, again, thinking of things that are undone. You think you've made progress and then whoops, things seem to revert back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow.
But that was great to teach in that area.
Yes. I wonder if maybe we can take a step back and
Sure.
you could talk a little bit about being at the University of Denver and doing your studies there and what was happening. And
Denver was a very, again, positive experience. I didn't know where I wanted to go for my doctorate. I looked at various programs, but I thought, again, I like adventure, but I'm cautious, but I still like adventure. And a friend had a very good nursing PhD experience in Boulder, Dr. Dorothy Pringle, who ultimately became Dean of Nursing at U of T for a number of sessions, and she had been at McMaster.
Okay.
And we hadn't known each other at McMaster, but we had all worked together at Lakeshore Psychiatric. She had been a nurse, Dot Pringle, Jean Marmorejo, who's now been involved a lot with assisted dying, and myself. We became really close friends, though we hadn't known each other at McMaster. It's fascinating who you meet as a young person, and you find many years later you're still on the same wavelengths. So she had a great PhD experience and said, "You'll love Colorado, it's a great place." And I looked at their program and it seemed to suit me. And so I applied, and Ken Kindlesberger was the dean, and he was a fine person, a fine gentleman. Interestingly, I think Florida his brother was a dean in Florida. That was the other program I was considering, which is interesting that two brothers were both deans in two programs. Probably they were very similar in their perspectives. And I did look at the University of Pittsburgh too. I have a good number of Croatian cousins, Valentiches, who live in Pittsburgh. It's a hotbed of sort of Croatian life, so I was interested there too. But I did decide on adventure, and Denver seemed to be quite another change for me, and the program suited me. Very straightforward, heavy on courses the first year, and then spend your next year just working on your research and finishing whenever you could. But that's exactly what I did. And it was very influential in the sense that the research that I did was on, again, sex differences in career management among social workers. And again, it was sex differences, not gender differences, because gender as a concept was known, but it was not yet prominent. So it was sex differences. And that rather intrigued me because I was interested in careers. I don't know quite where that interest came from. But I was interested in how people did choose their careers and how they pursued them. And so I would say perhaps Jim was instrumental in that too. Those were some of his interests, and he had done the first national survey for Canadian Association of Social Workers in terms of their careers. And that came out in, I think, 1974, the results were published, and that was where, I can't remember, he had a very catchy title, but basically he felt that social work had not lived up to its values in terms of respecting both men and women in their careers. So that did influence me. I wanted to see what was going on with women in particular in their careers. So I actually studied 600 social workers, and it did, I was aware of the larger context. It still has a sort of 70s sound to it because it was fairly individually focused. Career management wasn't defined in the literature. I couldn't find any definition, so I had to come up with something like career management refers to the implementation of career strategy through planning and pursuit of goals. That was sort of my sense of what career management was all about. And I did find some findings that have since been replicated in later studies about women tending to be a little less assertive and we didn't use the term, assertiveness wasn't quite the prominent thing that it became. women tended to not do some of the things that men tended to do, except for the women who were in social policy and administration. There was no difference that came through in the planning or the assertiveness scale that ultimately I developed for assertiveness in the work situation. Those women and men were very comparable, but the women who were primarily in clinical practice tended to not do the planning. They tended to follow their husbands' careers, so we sort of had them, or I had them categorized kind of ad hoc in their career. One of the key questions was, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And some people could see themselves and they had a plan of how to get there. And for others, that was like, what are you asking me? So that was a very influential study for me because it led later to a lot of work again on career planning and assertiveness in the workplace. And again, these were interests that Jim and I shared. So again, we did a lot of teaching and writing and worked on those areas. Recognizing that we were in a system of employment that didn't really favor equality in the workplace. It wasn't a matter of just, developing your assertiveness skills, but we were in a fine line. We wanted to make sure I think we were oriented to the context. And that's where the big influence of feminism was very prominent for me too. As I left Carleton, where I had tried to bring in some ideas about feminism, about what Betty Friedan was saying, and Germaine Greer, and Royal Commission on Women came out, I think, somewhere in the 60s, 65, somewhere in there. That was pretty prominent for me. And it became increasingly prominent at University of Calgary. And Dr. Frank Turner was very influential because I suggested to him at one point, when he was starting to write his first theory book, you don't have anything on feminism. And he said, I checked with my colleagues at Hunter College because he was on a sabbatical there. And he said, you were right, I need a chapter on feminism.
Nicely done.
So I thought he had asked me to do a chapter on systems theory. And I remember referring him to Dr. Peggy Rodway. So she did the systems theory, and I got to do the first feminist chapter, and then I did 2 others after that. And I was asked to do a 4th one, but by then and that was well into the 90s, if not later, but by then the university world had changed so much. Everything was digital. I could no longer even have access to the piles of journals that I love to go through. When you write a review chapter, you got to get into everything. And I remember finally saying, I'm not as involved in the practice world as I was, though I always had a small private practice, which from 1972 onward, each of us had a private practice. We wanted to stay connected to actually using our knowledge. And I declined that 4th chapter, and I referred him to Dr. Evelyn Milliken. And she did, I think, a great chapter, and she was probably closer to some of the issues than I was. And she was a former student of mine, so it was good. It's nice when you can, hand the baton to someone that you trust and respect. But feminism was a major influence. And so I recognized that a lot of the clinical work did focus on individuals in terms of, say, assertiveness in the workplace and so on. We wrote a book on that because we did a lot of workshops on that. But we also recognized you have to change the system. And so I had that opportunity at the University of Calgary because one of the I love social work because it gave you a chance to do so many different things. And I was asked to be the 2nd advisor to the president on women's issues at the University of Calgary. This was a position that President Murray Fraser had instituted at the University of Victoria. And then Susan Stratton was his first advisor to the president on women's issues. And she finished her term in 91, and I was asked to be the 2nd one. And that was terrific because that took you into every possible institutional kind of issue. And of course it was right after 1989, after the massacre at the École Polytechnique. So I was instrumental in organizing the first December 6th memorial service on campus. The first year after it happened, Susan Stratton had just called us informally on the campus just to get together. But by 1990, even though I wasn't in my advisor role, I think until 91, but in 1990 I was involved with setting up the very first service that we had on campus, which still continues. So that's one of my how can I put it? That's really memorable for me. We knew we had to work on change that involved the community, the attitudes in the university, all kinds of more socially oriented changes, systemic changes had to be made. Mind you, at around the same time, sometime in the 80s, some of us founded the Stop Racism Committee on campus because we were focusing on those issues. There were a lot of things that needed change. We had 122 recommendations in this report on how to make changes for women. It was recommendations for women in the 90s. And my job in, maybe I'm beginning to think maybe it was 1990, although I think it was 91 I started. Maybe it was 1990 to 91, 92 to 90. Anyway, it was 90s, early 90s. And my first task was to shepherd that document through every unit in the campus and get their responses to see. Can you imagine? Every unit.
The work.
And that was President Murray Fraser. He was very much oriented to bringing about change in the whole institution. Mm-hmm. Little wonder that he had a heart attack and basically died much too young, because he took on big challenges, and it was an honor to work with him and to have that kind of commitment from your senior person. That was wonderful. So that was a very interesting time. And that was a time where I also learned, much to Jim's dismay, to respond to all the media calls, on anything related to women or oppression or whatever. Sure, I can talk to you. And I mean, he was perhaps a little more cautious than I was, in the sense of you got to have a research basis for what you're saying, and there wasn't always. Sometimes it was a matter of human rights that you were speaking on. But I did add spokesperson to the list of qualifications for the advisor position, because the media wanted comment on everything that related, I think, to women, men, but we weren't into toxic masculinity or anything like that at the time, but on issues that related to women and men, relationship issues, and the sexual, anything sexual. So it was a time where I learned to speak up even more, because you were constantly being asked to offer a comment. And I really never had a bad experience with the media. So I thought the people who interviewed me were always very responsible and wanted to do the best they could in terms of a story, and I was happy to oblige. The one funny time was when Mayor Klein was going to do something about a red light district, and the way the headlines came through across Canada, social work prof approves red light district. I thought I had given a measured response, about here are some of the pluses about such districts, here are some of the possible negatives, but it came across in a much more, with the headlines anyway, that I was in favor. And I remember people worrying about, what will your mother think in Burlington? She wasn't expecting to see that, because I was interviewed across the country on that one. But it was okay, because I chose not to go on social media, except briefly once on Facebook when I was trying to track down a person who had participated in the Red Mile research, for which I got a lot of media attention. That was when women were lifting their tops.
Oh, yes.
This was 2005. And nobody was paying much attention. It was just these women are sex objects, that's what they are. And I had to track one. I thought, wait a minute, I want to know more about, no one's talking to the women themselves who are lifting their tops. It wasn't easy to get people to respond. I guess, who knows what all their reasons were. But anyway, I did finally connect with some, and I did get people who spoke about why they were lifting their tops, women who spoke about it. And I found that, so that was my brief foray into Facebook, but I didn't choose the others because I thought I would be compelled to respond, because I do like to interact with people. I'm quite outgoing, and I have a lot of groups, and I like to engage with people, but I thought I'll be overwhelmed. Now, I worked on 3 campaigns with Nahid Nenshi, and he did use the social media. I didn't. I like the face-to-face still, the direct encounter with people. So, but I love to write. And I had such a positive experience with writing in high school, and little columns about what was going on in the high school. And didn't write every week, but when I did, it was in the paper and there was your name. And I enjoyed the craft that is involved in trying to get your ideas formulated into words. And again, I had a really good English teacher, Norm MacDonald, as I recall was his name, famous name, but I don't know if he's related to the other Norm MacDonald. But at any rate, he was really good about saying, well, it's clear you can write and you like to speak. You should go into the public speaking contest. I did, and I kept winning. Yeah, I know, it was great. And again, I was out there and visible. And many people have fears about public speaking, and somehow Croatians are very verbal. I should put that down, note that, because I grew up in a culture where people love to talk and tell stories, and I remember going to political meetings with my dad, I'm being carried in somebody's arms, and just hearing people talk. So I had a good fostering of communication. So somewhere along the line, I do remember the first letter, and I'm putting together all my letters to the editor from, I think it was 1987. And I was really distressed by how the media were treating Margaret Trudeau at the time, because I could see that she was troubled in various ways, and yet the media was not giving her a kind of positive response. And that started my letter writing. And I think I find the letter writing is a real release for me. If an issue bugs me, and if I can write it quickly, you get it out. Now with the Calgary Herald, before I canceled it, now they won't publish any letter that I've written, but while I was a subscriber, I wrote a lot of letters to the editor. And similarly with the Globe and Mail, that's harder to get in the Globe and Mail, and you have to be quickly off the mark. I have continued to write for them. There are certain topics related to sexuality and assisted dying that is really important to me too, because I had a friend who had the first court-ordered exemption for assisted dying in 2016, and so that became a topic of real interest and concern for me. So I think that was where for years, people directed their attention to the paper, because it was a way of reaching the world and influencing. And I really always believed that social workers, if I could be a representative of the profession to some extent, that we had a lot of good ideas about what could happen to make our society fair, more just, more whatever, and we had opinions. Our work takes us into every area of life, and we have viewpoints. So I'm always thrilled now when a social worker gets good media attention. There was somebody on CBC recently talking about dreams, a professor somewhere in the United States, and I think wonderful. I think we should be giving much more attention to social workers, and they probably are on social media, but I stayed off it because I thought it will overwhelm me. I spend a lot of time on the computer anyway. I just didn't want to be caught up with that. I would feel the need, I'd be obsessed, and I'd want to respond to. And I just thought it's too much. I still will write letters to the editor because I find that enjoyable and therapeutic. It gets the issue off your chest, and I think it can still be an influence. Indeed, I still have people who tell me when I meet them at the folk festival or whatever. One woman remembered the Globe and Mail had a section on cubicle jungle. It was all about work-related issues. Well, that was great fun for Jim and me. Sometimes we wrote individual letters, sometimes we wrote letters together, but we wrote countless letters. And we got to know the other people who were responding. And that went on for about a year to 2 years. And somebody came and said, I remember all that problem solving. I think that's it. It's the problem solving in that particular, they would present you with a work problem, and then what was your sort of response? And so we had great fun with that, because especially if we had 2 letters from each of us in the same column. It just seemed, and we would have slightly different viewpoints, because even though we were a team in many respects, we still felt we were 2 individuals who have not always the same viewpoint on everything.
Do you remember any of those questions and problems that you solved in that particular column?
As I say, I'm organizing all that material, so I haven't been looking so much specifically, but they'd be common human resources type problem. I have a coworker with whom I disagree, etc., something's going on here, or I didn't think I was treated fairly in some situation. What should I do with this particular type of a boss? There are lots about bully bosses still I mean, the workplace for some people still hasn't really changed a great deal. It's amazing. In fact, I went to a recent debate. The NDP has a leadership debate right now. I'm still working for Nani Benchi, though I think the other candidates are wonderful. The NDP should be really proud. But a man spoke up in the audience and he said, I'm in a workplace where so much negativity occurs that's directed toward me, and if you speak up. And I thought, that's what my father experienced back in the 50s. And this man is saying almost the same kinds of things, even though there are unions and unions have representatives and so on. But there are a lot of issues in workplaces and people are still struggling, especially now. You don't want to risk losing your job. And that's what can happen. You can be the first one to be let go or whatever, if you take more assertive action about your situation. So I think we still have a lot of change that needs to occur before we are perhaps like some of the Scandinavian countries where the salary gap isn't so huge and where people have a chance, I think, in the workplace to express their views and not be treated negatively for that. We still, I think, give much too much power to, and salary, incredibly high salaries to CEOs, when I think lots of people could perform those particular jobs and do them quite well, and we could have a much more, what shall I say, equitable society.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So again, maybe we'll just take a little bit of a step back.
Sure.
You told us some of the things that happened when you moved to Calgary,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe you could talk a little bit more about making that transition
Sure.
from Denver to Calgary.
At Denver, we only had a couple of years, and Jim stayed there longer than I did, actually, and I went back to Ottawa, and then 76, we both came to Calgary, and we were partners. We just had a distance relationship for a couple of years there. So in a way, it was, for me, it was more a move within Canada, and it was a more difficult move for Jim. He had actually, way back when, been asked to start up the School of Social Work, way back in the 60s, but he had just taken a position with the government and decided to stick with the government position for a while, and then, so it's interesting that he came back. It was more difficult for him because he found some of the traditional practices and so on were really very challenging. He said, my goodness, I haven't seen anything like this since the 1940s. He was 20 years older than I was. For example, Foothills Hospital, this is 1976, had one social worker because social workers weren't in. They weren't in even in the school boards, whereas in Ontario, most of the school, we had lots of field placements in school boards because at Carleton I had been a liaison to students and field practitioners. So coming to Alberta in 76 after having a good experience in the University in Denver itself, we found it quite a change, and a not so great change. I know it's small things, but they started making, a Parisian baker was making croissants in Denver. Here you couldn't find croissants or cheeses, or it just wasn't very cosmopolitan at the time. It's radically changed. Now we're one of the fastest growing diverse communities in Canada, but at the time there were many practices that were not quite, what shall I say, they weren't making changes here. It was very traditional, and that was hard. But then we were in a social work faculty that was, I think, Tim Tyler was the dean, and they were, although he did try to, I was by then an associate professor at Carleton. The school had been transferred from University of Ottawa to Carleton. And when I got a part-time position the first year, it was only part of the year, that was interesting. It was a model where we tried to integrate materials. That was Dr. Maureen Wilson, and it was, I think, very forthcoming to try to bring courses together so they weren't in little silos also. Next year I applied, and while I was being offered the position, I learned that the male candidate was going to be hired as an associate professor, whereas I was expected to drop back to assistant, and I thought, no, and 5,000 less. I thought, no way, I can get a job in the community. I don't have to deal with this, and I made that clear, and ultimately was hired as an associate, and with the salary that I had anticipated. So that felt good. And overall, the experience in Calgary was good, except for one period, and I won't go into many details, but there was a period of a couple of years where faculty, for various reasons, became incredibly divided, and there was a grievance that was in process. It was a difficult time. That's hard when you're with your colleagues, and I think things were patched up somewhat over the years and relationships established again with people, but there was a period where or when organizations have difficulties, there aren't a lot of good remedies to assist organizations. Indeed, I wrote, the first article that I got published was on organizational development and social work. That was at Denver prior to coming here, as I think about it. But I just felt that social workers could have as their clients any entity. And that was the joy of social work, that you weren't restricted. You might think of yourself as a clinical social worker, but your client could be the community, the organization, the whatever, the broader. And that's why working, in a sense, with on the and she's mayoralty campaigns was good, because you had the city there to work with, and he had a great vision, I think, for the city, and so now we'll see what happens in his run for the leadership of the provincial NDP, because social workers, I think, are really good at trying to connect with people who also have power, and we have more power now than we did, because I think, a little bit, but I think the more visible we are, the more chance we have to establish certain ideas that might get picked up. And they're all people of all kinds of ideologies. In my coffee group, there's a person who I respect greatly, who was an MP in Brian Mulroney's government. I can't remember what era, but somewhere there in the 80s. And while we may disagree about some things and how change occurs, there are many things we agree on. And there are change agents in every political grouping. And it's good to get connected. Look at Hugh Segal, who was promoting low income or guaranteed income. And that was one of his primary things that he worked hard on, to try to bring about a basic change to help eliminate some of the poverty. So I'm very fortunate. There's always been good people around that I can connect to. One of the good groups that we started up, and I was a founding member here in Calgary, was Calgary Social Workers for Social Justice. Yvonne Schmitz, Linda McFarlane, myself, a couple of other people. And it's a group that's still going on. And more recently, we were an interest group of the Alberta College of Social Workers. And that wasn't that satisfactory, because we felt the college was not as proactive around social issues as we would have liked it. I think the college was influenced by being cautioned always by the lawyers about not being too proactive and to just focus on the regulatory aspects. But where was social justice then? It wasn't like Friends of Medicare. You didn't hear from social workers. And so the government, more in the last year or two, really forced the college to just focus on regulatory issues. And we have evolved another organization called Social Workers Association of Alberta, SWA, Social Workers, got it right, just a year old. And our Calgary Social Workers for Social Justice may become an action group of the other organization, which now can focus on social issues, justice concerns, elimination of poverty was our big one that we always tried to work on different issues. And then there were several politicians in the provincial government, and still are, even though they're in opposition, who are social workers. Isn't that great? Because it means that there is a chance to make some more powerful changes in our society. So I've gotten carried away a little in terms of responding, but I think it's how can I put it? I think we have lots of great ideas, and yet some things, we would have a hard time getting some social workers in Calgary to be able to come pre-COVID to face-to-face meetings, because their employers wouldn't give them time off for an hour working lunch focusing on social justice. So we think some things still have to change within social work too. And I know social justice issues, sometimes become more prominent, sometimes less so. But I think, as I say, I'm very pleased when social workers are visible and are out there and are expressing their views about what can happen, because I think we have a lot of great ideas. And if we persist, we can make certain things happen. right now, I must say, at age 82, I do feel time's running out, and there's still so much undone work. And some things where you thought you made changes, feels like it came back again, especially around violence against women and other groups that have a number of characteristics. I mean, the concept of intersectionality has come in, and so, but we were aware of that before. It wasn't just gender. We knew people were also poor, or there was racism going on. All of these things affected us. And, you know, I thought we made progress in the 80s and 90s. And then you realize, whoops, you know, a new position. We do have a provost who deals with all the sort of equity issues, and we were promoting that back in the 90s in some of those recommendations. We felt so often we would find different offices were working together. Well, why not have, you know, now we do have I think she has a vice presidential role, but it took a long time for that to happen, that someone who really had clout, because we felt we didn't. We were all kind of grassroots type people in the university. And universities have a facade, I think, of democracy, and it isn't always that evident. And women weren't that prominent. It was the chilly climate in the 80s and 90s, that lovely film that was made by women at Western Ontario, I think. And people don't always remember, but that's how it was. In certain groups, I remember the few women who were, say, in the General Faculty's Council or whatever, we'd sort of find each other in the meeting, the few women who were around, and then second each other's motions just to get our names visible. And I think some of that has changed, but institutional change, we know, takes time.
So I think that brings up an interesting concept or process. I think you're kind of talking about collaboration or having, you know, like solidarity with other people that you work with. I wonder if you want to say a little bit about that.
Yes, I think it is important to have that kind of solidarity. And fortunately, even in a province like Alberta that has been dominated by conservative type politicians, there were the progressive conservatives. Peter Lougheed always gets mentioned as one of them, and he was. There always were groups here. You could always find like-minded people, and you followed that Margaret Mead, I think, saying, just find a few people who have the similar kinds of ideas that you do, and you actually can make some changes. So I think that collaboration is good, and there are groups, Friends of Medicare, Pembina Institute, Vibrant Cities, Vibrant Calgary, I've forgotten the name, but they picked up on some of the issues that had been raised about poverty in Calgary, and that's their responsibility to work on it. So partnering with those groups in collaboration, we hope that SWA, the Social Workers Association, will be one of those groups that partners, and they've already said that's part of their plan to work with these different groups, because then you have a stronger voice, and you can be more, again, visible, whether it's a march or a protest or a rally. And I am a little more careful now about rallies. My son gets very protective now that, you know, there's violence, you don't want to get caught up in something. But I think if you can continue to make it known what your values are as a social worker, then you find these other groupings, and then that gives you strength and solidarity, and you can make some progress. So I think that's something that we continue to, I say social workers, and I think SWA, which we were instrumental in getting going. Even another group that I was a founding member of, and it was the first, I think, environmental type group. It's all about 15 years ago. We called it CCAN, Calgary Climate Action Network, and it was our attempt to bring together different groups that were emerging about climate concerns. And for quite a while, 3 or 4 years, I'd say we were quite active. I actually hosted the first big rally that we had at City Hall on climate change. So now, of course, everybody's into climate change. I just was leafing through a magazine that I didn't really find that much interest in, I have to say it. Knights of the Round Table, I think it's called. I think it's a local group, but there's a nice magazine. Anyway, the whole magazine was all on environmentalism and climate issues, which really kind of surprised me because I hadn't seen that kind of content. So, I mean, that whole movement has brought together all kinds of groupings, and hopefully there will be an impact. But I will say living in Alberta with the current government provincially is hard, because I find myself in such disagreement with so many aspects of what they are proposing. I strongly believe that we should be working together. Again, the collaboration idea, provincial and federal, doesn't have to be at odds with each other. We can collaborate, and that's not the stance that is taken by our current government. It's let's fight the federal government at every turn, and I think that unsettles those of us who see much more collaboration as a way of moving forward. We're all in a country that's wonderful. Why not make it more wonderful for as many people as we can, so that ideas of inclusion really are operationalized and everybody gets a chance to reach out and reach for their goals.
Excellent.
That's my political statement of the day.
I'm wondering if there are any other community-based activities or projects that you want to speak about that you haven't spoken about yet.
Well, as I say, just the first one that comes to my mind is working with my friend Hannah Schaefer, who had that court-ordered exemption. In 2013, she was diagnosed with ALS, and she was a very good friend of ours. And as she saw her physical condition deteriorate, she very quickly came to the idea that she wanted assisted dying of some kind. So she asked me to help her and her partner, Daniel Lauren. Could we work together? And especially as she deteriorated quite quickly to the point where in the end she was just typing with 3 fingers of her left hand, and lost her speech, lost her capacity to walk, etc. So we were putting in applications to Switzerland, etc. And I remember thinking, she's so resolute. She's such a hero when you're facing death and you want to expedite it because you don't want to live as a person who chokes on her own phlegm. That's usually how, I guess, how people with ALS die, and she was just so resolute. I had to admire it, and I remember thinking of some of the friends who had died and they were distant, and I hadn't maybe made all the efforts I could have maybe made to stay in touch with them. I thought, this time I'm here, we're in the same city, we'll go for broke. And then it came about in 2015, I guess, the Supreme Court had a ruling, but that to make it okay to have assisted dying in Canada, but the legislation was not forthcoming, and the government was given a number of months till June 2016 to come through with the legislation. So in that interim period, about 4 months, people could apply for a court-ordered exemption for assisted dying. And once Hannah heard of that, that was it. So we started to, instead of thinking of going to Switzerland, which is awkward, traveling when you're that disabled, we didn't know she'd have the strength to do the insertion herself. So that's an area that's still of interest to me. I did write a recent letter to the editor, but I was about 2 or 3 days late. 2 beautiful letters came out today. So I will continue with that, because I'm impressed with the people who are working in Dying with Dignity, for example, and the care that people like Stephanie Green have taken, that there are standards, that there are good practices. And Alberta was in many respects ahead of some of the other provinces, and that was when the NDP had its government here. So I will continue to work on that area. I think the most recent article was from someone who really, I think, was fear-mongering. Yes, we have some aspects of our social safety net that don't work, but that doesn't mean we toss out MAID as if MAID is going to, in my view, this is what this person was saying, we are pressuring people into MAID. Now, come on, let's look at the thousands of cases where I think everything has enabled people to make a very considered, careful decision about MAID. And I think that should continue, and we'll see if there's future change, because there's still issues related to psychiatric condition only or mature minors, and we don't have advanced directives or request yet. So there are issues yet to be dealt with, and making those changes isn't going to fix the social safety net. That has to be done through other means. And so why sort of fearmonger? I think this last person, Professor Murdoch, I believe, was really fearmongering that, you know, that it's just going to be eugenics all the way, and we're going to be really pressuring all kinds of folks who have no other options. Well, let's fix the social safety net then. That's a great focus. No one's saying we shouldn't, but that doesn't mean that people are going to be pressured into. There may be some instances that need to be examined. I don't deny it. There's some sad situations, but I still want to continue working on that. And I think violence against a whole lot of people is still, you know, whether it's racism or women's issues, we obviously have not made enough changes yet to give people safety, especially First Nations people who are in such high proportion, women in particular, the missing and murdered women. I think that's been a real turnaround for social work. You know, I did, you know, I was in school in the 60s, as you know, and there's nothing that I ever heard of in terms of the 60s scoop at the time. And it's always puzzled me because, you know, I don't like being labeled an agent of social control. There were issues, obviously, things did happen. And it puzzled me because I think I knew lots of social workers over many years, and I did not see them acting in ways that I felt were oblivious to people's rights. But I'm also not going to deny First Nations experiences. So I think there's been a real turnaround, and the province is good in this regard. I think people really have genuinely tried to make changes, and of course the situation's greatly changed in universities now. When I was there at McMaster, I don't think I could have told you that I knew somebody who was an Indian or First Nations, despite my doing that paper. They just weren't getting into university. And even here, probably in the 80s, I had to have a real struggle to get one First Nations student into our program. She was just a little below the B- level, and grad studies was not going to accept her. And I thought, I got her in, and I was glad. And she'd had a wonderful career with the city of Calgary, and I thought, there. But now we've gone much farther, so I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its findings has helped bring about some really needed changes. We always had a Native Center, I think that's what it was called, and I worked with Cheryl Shannon Grey Eyes a lot. She was on our Stop Racism committee, so it's not like we weren't tuned in, but we didn't have much clout. And I think now there's much more power, because you need power to make changes. You can't avoid it. And so I think there are changes that have occurred that are good. We don't have a lounge anymore in our Faculty of Social Work. We have a grandmother's lodge. And that's good. That's good. Change needs to, we need to evolve and not just have sort of a token Indian, I put that in quotes, or, you know, one or two here or there. No, we need lots of folks, and they're the ones who are experiencing still so much violence for various reasons and difficulties in just living in some of the situations. So we still got a lot of issues, and I know various federal governments and provincial have tried to do so much, but it's unfinished work.
Very much so.
Yeah, and I don't have any easy answers. I think we have to just keep on persisting and working and trying to figure out what changes can we make that are respectful of people's culture and so on, and yet give people opportunities. That's why I liked working with Nahi Nenshi, whom I really do, and I like the other candidates too. They're really all excellent people, don't get me wrong in that respect. But his committees that I served on were all on civic engagement. How do we get people working together to bring about, to develop the kind of communities that we need that give everyone a chance for education, for health services, for what they need to be able to fulfill their goals. So I think the Liberals and the NDP federally are working together to try to bring about some needed changes. So maybe there's some hope.
Excellent. You've mentioned a number of people along the way,
Yeah.
but I'm just wondering if there are any other mentors that you want to mention.
I've had good fortune, and I would applaud all those folks whom I have mentioned. I certainly want to say that it was a pleasure to live with my partner, who also had lots of very forward-looking ideas. He saw himself as a feminist. Now, everybody can't duplicate having a living situation where you find someone so very compatible with your own self. But we had that good fortune, and were able to work together, to teach together, to offer services together. We co-taught in the human sexuality all those years. So certainly I valued that, and was forever fortunate, and even did a little research study at one point on couples who live and work together, because that wasn't that common that you could have that chance. And found there were couples who made it work for them, and I haven't published that one. I'm sort of still, there's still presented on it. There's still unfinished, some loose ends that I still need to finish up. So who else would I say? Certainly I have good colleagues still who are influential. Loretta Young, for example, she's a person who's living in Amsterdam now she came here with her then husband, Chris Bagley. She came as a social worker, he was a faculty member, but I still value her opinion. I went over some of our questions for this interview with Loretta, because I love her capacity to be able to think about the issues and so on. The people I had a brief coffee with today, Dawn Collins and Heather Coleman, two of my colleagues who were at Lethbridge and also here. And we were talking in the coffee group about what are the developments in social work? What did regulation do to our profession? Did it help us? I think in some respects it did. In some respects, maybe the social justice concerns were a little downplayed, because they were cautious. They had to, at least in this province, and they've acknowledged that they felt they were cautioned by their lawyers to be cautious about trying to make change, because you never knew how the government might react to them. So there are many good people. I don't know her personally, Cindy Blackstock, for example. I think she's done wonderful work, and it's impressive to see what she's done. I will stop talking. There are many colleagues talking about different colleagues, and I think there are people locally here, Jake Kuiken, who had years and years of working on the professional association. Richard Ramsey, one of our colleagues, they're impressive people, and they've all influenced me, because one of the big issues that I worked on here, I'm trying to think, Francis Wright of the famous Five Foundation was an ally, changing the title of alderman to councillor. I got involved in 1987. Again, I remember that quite distinctly, because I had a letter to the editor and then a letter to Mayor Klein, who casually dismissed our concerns, or my concerns. It took till Nenchi's mayoralty campaign in 2010 to get that passed. 1987 to 2010 to take effect in 2013.
It's a long haul.
It's a long haul, but I was very proud of that issue, because it really was a grassroots movement, and I was very involved in it and appreciated all the work that was done. And now nobody thinks twice about the term councillor. But the idea of alderman, that was like sacred. We had women on council who voted against various motions that had come up. But for me, language has always been so important. So I'm still trying to work on that. For example, retired, I don't use that term. So I have a really hard time with the surveys that come to me, where I'm supposed to fit into one of these gaps, or one of these, categories. And retired isn't a good one, and it isn't for a number of my colleagues. There's got to be a category for people who volunteer, almost nonstop, aren't paid for it, don't expect to be paid with money, but are working full-time, almost full-time. There should be another category. And retired, I didn't join the Retired Social Workers Association. I said, change the name, I'll join. Now our Emeliti Association, to be more inclusive, I tried to change that name because it was emeritus initially, and they finally changed it to emerita, and I said, that's still masculine, plural. I took Latin in high school. So that didn't work, but now they changed it to retirees to be congruent with other groups. And that's more inclusive. That's great. Anybody in the university now, if they work there, I think 10 years, can become a member of that group. Great, we're more inclusive, but we're still using a term that doesn't, it's a term that still has some stigma and negativism attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, in all the categories for relationships, Jim and I chose not to get married. He had a good marriage, he respected it. We didn't want to be married. So I don't fit any of the categories. I don't like widow because I think we weren't married, so I'm not a widow, but on the other hand, I'm not single, never married either, so I don't have any way to categorize. So I've got to work with some, and Jim was a survey researcher. I thought, well, categories would he come up with that would fit better? And there isn't always an other where you can put it in. So language is still really important to me. I'd like to continue working on language. There are a lot of things. Master of ceremonies, for example. We don't need another master of. And that keeps me active. Guys, the common thing, everybody's a guy. Mm-hmm. I don't identify with that term. Please find another if you can. But again, it's so much in our common lingo. That's a hard one. But I'm not alone. Again, you always find people who are on the same wavelength. And that's very reassuring when you do connect. And I'm thinking of recent events I've gone to where you meet people who have spent ages working on, there was one on missing and murdered women that came up recently, and it's amazing what people are doing. So it's always great to find colleagues with whom you share some common interests. And I have the good fortune to have my health, so I can connect with a lot of people. I'm also interested in cities a great deal, and our son is an urban planner, so that works well. I can bug him about things in the city. In fact, he's working on the Green Line, which is great, and that will open up a whole lot of more people have access to transit, which will be great. Even though now he gets very concerned, there's been a total role reversal when I take a late night, not late night, let's say there's a film festival on, I have to tell him when I get home safely if I've taken the LRT, the light rail transit, because there has been a lot of violence, which is, I think, diminished somewhat. But then we have a large homeless population, unhoused has become the latest term, population and we still haven't figured out how to best deal with this. Someone was in a coffee group today, which is a great group, was talking about Finland and how Finland has some way of dealing with every person who comes to Finland gets established with housing. Mm-hmm. Incredible. They don't have a homeless or unhoused problem. We should really be studying a lot of these situations to learn from each other. But then we also have so many troubles in the world that are active war. Those things concern me because Croatia had a lot of troubles during the war, whereas different republics trying to establish themselves with independence. That was a really hard time because I am still very connected with family and with their issues, and did look at sexual violence as an aspect of war. And why did it happen? It happened in the troubles during the 90s in Croatia, in former Yugoslavia, I should say. Mm-hmm. So that's sad, there's still so many issues. We could go on and on about how many issues there still are that have not been resolved. And I think my dilemma is, time's running out. What can one do? How do you spend your time? How do you communicate what you think is important to communicate? That's tricky to do. But that's why I like being on campus. I'll come in at least once or twice a week at odd times because of the parking regulations.
Yes.
We have to declare our parking as a taxable benefit.
Really?
Yeah, that's the only university in Canada where that is, again, sometimes I don't like lawyers. Apparently that was our lawyer's interpretation. But I do like being on campus because you meet students in different faculties at various events, and I go to a good number of them. That's great. If they want to talk, I enjoy communicating around issues, and consequently, I'm very, very fortunate to have those kinds of opportunities. Plus, I have lots of like-minded friends in different groups that I'm in, like the Croatian Heritage Society or Folk Dance Friday or Kirby Chorus or a sing-along group. So I have a tennis, lots of things with tennis. And you can use those groups in ways, how can I put this? You can communicate what you believe in and maybe you influence some people. And I try to, because what's the point of not trying to influence around things that you think are important? So, you've asked once in your list of questions, what would you say to students? And I would say, go for it. If you think something's important, and you hope they do, and they do, then it's important to keep on making that point or connecting with people who may share your views, figuring out how to make change. I think I've always been action-oriented, getting things done. And that kind of ethic, I think, again, comes from my parents, basically, bottom line. They may not have been active in social change, but they knew how to work to achieve their goals. And they communicated that to me and my brother. And so it's fine. People say you're too busy and you have too many diverse interests, but actually I thrive on them. And as long as I can have the physical component too, the folk dancing or playing tennis, we're going to Quebec City to play tennis in the over 75s, which are happening this August.
That's so great.
Yeah, it is great. And I figure if I don't do it this year, I'm not going to wait till I'm 83. Better do it this year and hope there aren't too many active 75-year-olds.
That's so great. You've kind of answered this question, but just to clarify, if you were going to give advice to an emerging social worker who would like to be an innovator and a change maker like yourself, who wants to be a leader, what advice would you give them?
I would say, trust yourself. Check out your community. When we made the first unisex washroom at Carleton in 1973, we didn't check with senior administration when we took off the men's. Social work was put on in an engineering building where the seats were narrowed down, but there was only one washroom for men on our floor. We were mostly women in the program, so we thought, let's take off, just make it a washroom. 1973, wow. Senior administration had not heard of it and hit the roof that we dared do this. So we learned that you got to check out your community before you institute some radical changes. So we had to put the sign back up. There were cubicles in the washroom, so it would have been perfectly safe. So trust yourself around what you think is an issue. Check out your community to see where the obstacles are and who you have to work with in order to get permission. Sometimes you do. If you're part of an institution, I don't believe in breaking the law or going just against rules. Check out the community, see where you have to make changes, and then plan your strategies. And don't give up. I mean, that's one lesson that certainly I and others have learned. You don't give up as long as you can find people that you can stick with. And I think nothing brings people together like working on some cause that really is important to them. You really form, I think, very meaningful relationships. And I find that happens even, say, in the folk dance group. You find the people that you link up with because you share common values, and then you proceed to work on them. And you try to convince them to get a membership in the NDP. So that's what I would say to students. Don't give up, persist. It is possible to bring about changes. Like right now, Calgary's in the throes of a major issue about rezoning the whole community. And people are really divided. And okay, I think through communication with each other, we can make some of the needed social changes. And I'm looking forward to seeing this community perhaps tweak the general, let's rezone everything. They'll tweak it in some various ways. We'll come up with a compromise. Hopefully it will improve the situation for a good number of people. So I would say it's possible to make change. Don't give up.
Wonderful. On that note, I'm wondering if we could look at some of the artifacts that you brought with you.
I did bring some because I saw the request that possibly we could, and I'll just pull some out.
That's
although
lovely.
I have to admit it felt, well, I have these at my funeral because people do bring such things, and but that's okay. If that becomes the case, that's okay. I can live with that. I hesitated on this one, but I thought This one was for working at Calgary Sexual Assault Center. We had by then worked on the legislation so that rape became sexual assault. And that was some legislation, I don't know, that we did work on. And I appreciated this a great deal because in 1972-73 in Ottawa, I had been approached by she wasn't doctor then, she was a sociology master's student, Susan Hess Nelson. And she had an idea for a rape crisis center in Ottawa. And I thought that was a great idea, and I thought some social work students might be interested, and we set up the very first one. And the third person we contacted was a physician, Dr. Martin Gillison. So we had 3 of us, and we had a service where we could accompany people who had sexual assault, it wasn't called it rape at the time still, to the police, or we had telephone counseling. So that was the establishment of the first one there. And when I moved to Calgary, so that was 72, 73, I've checked with Susan on this. We're now in touch. She lives in Nanaimo, and she is Dr. Susan Hess Nelson. And Janet Lockington in Edmonton was one of the first employees we hired. So when I came here, I found a collective of women meeting very close to where we lived. We lived downtown because there was no place. And it was a group that emerged, and in 76 we set up the first rape crisis center here in Calgary, and they liked what I told them about what we had done in Ottawa with setting up that first center. They liked that. They liked the way that we tried to have a more open board where we included the police and people with different backgrounds. So that's one that I'm really proud, and I stuck with them for a good number of years because they were a great group. And let me see a few other things. This one I'll show you. It was the Order of the University of Calgary, and that was 2008, well after I had left my paid full-time position. I don't retire, I leave my paid full-time position and transition to all kinds of other things. And to receive the Order of the University of Calgary was really great because it meant that your colleagues recognized that you had provided service not only to the university but also to the community. And that fits well with social work. We're supposed to do service. That's part of who we are. So getting it recognized by your colleagues is really very meaningful. I'll just maybe perhaps put that there. The others, again, how can I put this? Which one? As I say, this was useful, preparing funerally. Oh. No, I know. Bring these out. Yes, this is one I'm very proud of too. 2010 Pioneer Award from Alberta Society for the Promotion of Sexual Health, as well as being a member of ASECT. We always loved those certifications and kept them for a long time while we had our private practices, which I had till about 2010 maybe, and then I finally said, okay, time to turn to other things. But this is a great organization. It's really more national than Alberta, and they recognize the work that Jim and I had done in terms of instituting that first course and then continuing on to work on reproductive rights from birth control. Jim was equally involved as I was. So that was again, anything where your colleagues recognize you is really terrific. Similarly with these last 2, maybe 3, sorry about that. I apologize for bringing all these out. But you know, they're very meaningful. Let me just think what was, okay. This one was 2014, and that was John Hutton Memorial Award for Social Action and Policy. And that was a real pleasure to get something like that, because I did come from a program that was modeled on the Smith College. So that's where Swithin had, well, he went to Columbia, but he also modeled St. Patrick's a little bit on the Smith College model, and that was very clinically oriented. So to get an award for social action and policy was really amazing to me. And we did try to make some changes that we thought could be helpful to the wider community. And that one was followed with Glenn Drover, who was a great guy.
Oh, yes, Glenn Drover taught me social policy at Dalhousie.
Okay, and I knew him in Ottawa when I was there. So that was another one for outstanding service over the years. And again, I valued what his input had been. So again, you know, you feel, how can I put this? Almost, you know, there's that imposter syndrome that you start thinking about. What I did because it had meaning for me and for others, and it also had rewards. To make something happen is terrific. McMaster has been particularly helpful and wonderful in this regard, and that's the last thing I think I have here. They honored me in 2023, which is really very recent, with an alumni award, and I will bring that out very carefully because it's there's some others at home, but this one is really special. You'll see what I mean. When I went through security, the woman was the agent was very grim in her facial look. Like, what was I carrying? And that was well wrapped and very strange looking. And finally she unpackaged everything, pulled out this incredibly beautiful piece, read the inscription, which was Mary Valentich, Alumni Gallery, McMaster University, inducted on June 1st, 2023, alumni. Talk about, you know, your early experiences being honored in this way with this beautiful sculpture. And then she looked at me, the agent with the cold face, who had been very serious, and she said, "Congratulations."
How wonderful.
Wasn't that sweet? And I said, "Thank you," because I had put it in my carry-on because I didn't want to harm it in some way, because it is a very precious piece for me. So that's basically the memorabilia, but I wanted to give you this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
You'll see that Hannah was somebody that I think is very special. So you feel free to pass it around. I donated one to the alumni office, but they didn't. Oh yeah, we can do that. Yes. I didn't actually get it in the library. So at some point, if you want to donate it to the library, that's just fine with me, because I intended to do that. So those are some of the things that that's it.
Wow. Well, I'm very honored to have spent this time with you and to hear about all the work that you've done over. I'm really moved over your life's work. And thank you so much for giving us your time.
Well, thank you.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
for a chance to reflect on things that I haven't, that aren't always something you think about. And it's a strange situation to have had almost, I was going to say good fortune. No, there's been work to get the things achieved. But there is this, not imposter syndrome, but a little bit of like, some people just don't have all the chances. I had such support from parents initially, you know, that time when I came back in '68, when I took the position at Carleton, I found my dad in the hospital diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And I thought, I was already on salary. They gave me like a good chunk of time where I could go to Europe. You know, my parents said, "Here's my dad in the hospital." He died 2 years later, but they said, "You take that position." Because I was ready to think, I can't go start this new job in Ottawa when my dad is basically dying. But they said, "No, this is your chance, you take it." That kind of support is what brought me to where we are today. That's support from friends, from family, from friends, from other people. Doing this kind of a chance, I said to my brother, "Yes, there's pressure. You should see the list of questions they provided us with for the interview." On the other hand, I said it's an honor to have the opportunity to reflect on your own career and to do it with someone who is compatible and whose work you are admiring and getting